Good morning again. For those of you who weren't with us a couple of weeks ago, my name is Brendan McInerny. I'm a Catholic theologian teaching in the western suburbs and very excited to be speaking to you all once again. In my last talk, I presented an introduction to the theology of play, discussing those activities and even things that we recognize as ends in themselves, serving no real purpose, no real external purpose. I made the case then that we are made for play by virtue of being made in God's image and likeness, because play is the mode of God's action in the creation of the universe. I also highlighted how challenging it can be to appreciate this God-given importance of play in our contemporary world, which has tended to reduce virtually all things to utility, purpose, and work, usually measured in economic output. If I had to give practical advice in light of that lecture, it would be to find more time for play in your own life. Take time away and waste it in fun. This talk will take us a little bit further and ask what play has to do with one of the most necessary activities of life, eating. We need to eat in order to live. So it would seem that here, if nowhere else, play, rest, and leisure have nothing really to offer, have no bearing whatsoever. The whole process involved in eating, from growing food on the farm to the transformation of cooking, seems like it is simply work, each step efficiently ordered to the final transfer of energy and nutrients into our body. My case today is that, as a matter of fact, play has a lot to do with eating, cooking, and even the agriculture that grows the food that comes to our table. What I hope to show is that the theology of play provides a much more pleasurable approach to our food and the world, a much more pleasurable approach to our food and the world than the system in which we currently live. I'm going to present something alongside this, just to kind of accompany my words, just like last time. I think this system, this technocratic system, was exemplified for me a few years ago in 2015. About the same time the Flint water crisis was beginning to make national headlines, some of you might remember that the residents of Adrian, Minnesota were forced to bring in bottled water due to the contamination of the city's water supply. No doubt, Adrian failed to generate as much national media attention as Flint later would, in part due to its small size. It barely counts 1,200 people as its residents in a county of merely 20,000. But further, I think the cause and apparent solution to the Adrian crisis discouraged interest. In Adrian, in many respects, despite the lack of clean water, everything worked according to plan. The whole incident was by most standards quite boring. To my knowledge, no one got sick, and everything has now returned to normal. Though with our current drought conditions, one can easily imagine issues of water quality returning. The immediate cause of the crisis was the breakdown of a machine, a water purification system that had become essential for public health. The machine was the chosen remedy to the dangerously high levels of nitrates in the water supply. Such nitrates cause a condition that prevents red blood cells from releasing oxygen in the body, which in turn leads to hypoxia. Consuming too much nitrate-contaminated water effectively causes the body to suffocate. The nitrates are not present in Adrian's water supply because of government ineptitude or corruption or a criminal conspiracy. They are present because of the manifest economic interests of the residents of Adrian, who survive either directly or indirectly on money made in farming the ubiquitous crops of corn and soybeans. And in order to farm at the economically necessary scale, farmers around Adrian, just like everywhere, typically must use large amounts of artificial nitrogen-rich fertilizers. Crops absorb these fertilizers quite inefficiently, and the excess runoff makes its way into streams, rivers, lakes, and clearly city water sources. Ultimately, some of the runoff from places like Adrian can find its way to the Gulf of Mexico, where it contributes to a vast dead zone, estimated to be about the size of Delaware at its largest, completely void of marine life. Despite the absence of drama, or perhaps because of this absence, I think the state of affairs in Adrian, Minnesota can serve as an excellent concrete example of the technocratic paradigm in action. A little attention reveals the way in which the logic and power of technology, utilitarian calculation, and short-term financial gain encourages a deformed vision of the human relationship with the non-human world, a vision that leads to abuse and destruction. To repeat for those of you who may not have been here last week, the principal characteristic of the technocratic paradigm, as implied by its name, is the way in which technology dominates human thought and action. The technocratic paradigm is the result of the success of human ingenuity, of our ability to turn the things of the world to our purposes on the basis of study. Technology is, of course, an anthropological constant. From the earliest Homo sapiens and our nearest cousins in the family tree, we have been tool makers. However, in the course of roughly the last 2 centuries, technological power over nature, both non-human and human, has increased exponentially. Enumerating this increase in power exhaustively would be impossible. But consider only how the steam engine broke our millennia-long bondage to the powers of muscle, wind, and water current to get work done. Not only did this enable the human being to cover great distances without wasting her own energy, it allowed for the explosion in manufacturing and building that made the modern world. Though the use and scope of technology is not identical with technocracy as such, Pope Francis reminds us that our technological products are not neutral, for they create a framework, he says, which ends up conditioning lifestyles and shaping social possibilities. And, as Josef Pieper warns, the danger inherent in this situation is that man might erroneously come to regard the world as a whole and the created things in it, above all, man himself, in the same manner in which he regards, correctly, his own artifacts belonging to the technological sphere. In other words, and this is still Pieper speaking, man is beginning to consider the whole of creation as completely fathomable, fully accessible to rational comprehension, and above all, as something which it is permissible to change, transform, or even destroy. In its fullest flowering, then, technocracy sees nature as an insensate order, as a cold body of facts, as a mere given, as an object of utility, as raw material to be hammered into useful shape. It views the cosmos similarly as a mere space into which objects can be thrown with complete indifference. As technocracy reduces the world to the status of means, so too does it exalt the human being to the status of, quote, a subject who, using logical and rational procedures, progressively approaches and gains control over an external object. That was once again Pope Francis. The ideal human being is one in control of the available tools, one who alone determines the ends to which things should be put, one who can dominate. And this dominance comes about through the pursuit and application of specialized knowledge. However, as our rational procedures provide us with an ever more refined knowledge of useful data and the methods by which we can put things to our uses, that is, as our knowledge and power over things through technology becomes ever more specialized, we progressively lose sight of the proper ends to be pursued. So technocracy tends to grant extraordinary power over things, but it provides little or no direction for the exercise of that power. We can do a lot. We just don't know what we're supposed to do. Though technocracy is a wide-reaching phenomenon, touching down in a myriad ways in our life, virtually every aspect of our life is shaped by technocracy, the Adrian water crisis displays its tendencies in miniature. At first, the situation in Adrian appears to be a simple, unfortunate consequence of our current technological solution to a late-stage problem that has roots that extend back to human origins. Right? From the outset, we are cast into the problem of food acquisition, a problem because we need to eat to live and food is scarce. The technologies of agriculture, the domestication of plants and animals, and the creation of all the other tools we might use to bring food to table, provide a potential partial solution to this predicament by allowing us to harness the productivity of soil, grass, and animal life, and thereby increasing food production, increasing yields, and allowing for much greater population growth. Scripture seems to back up this agonistic view of agriculture. As the second creation myth tells us, the soil itself has been cursed in the fall of Adam. It will bring forth thorns and thistles more readily than the grain that will become our daily bread. Moreover, the soil has its own limits of fertility. Raising crops in one spot year after year drains the potency of soil and therefore requires regular renewal. Agriculture, solving the problem of food scarcity, creates a new problem of fertility. Until a century ago, this meant that human beings could only farm according to the limits imposed by their specific land, plants, and livestock. It can be managed and coaxed to produce more to a certain extent, but farmed too intensively by failing to allow the land to rejuvenate, and the soil will inevitably be depleted and no crops will grow until the soil's lost health returns. When Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch developed an industrial process to synthesize ammonia a century ago, they cast off the limits of native soil and gave the world a seemingly infinite supply of artificial fertility. Today, it is estimated that 2/3 of global food production uses fertilizers produced in the Haber-Bosch process, feeding roughly half the world population. The problem of toxicity caused by the excess nitrogen is then solved by water treatment technologies, which from time to time may break, requiring repair and stopgap solutions like hauling in potable water, as we find in Adrian. Scientists are at this moment searching for other solutions, such as crops that have been gene spliced to fix nitrogen like legumes, that is, return nitrogen to the soil like legumes can do. Describing the crisis in terms of this linear process of problem and solution reveals the standard mental habits of technocracy. It thrives in the identification and solution of discrete problems and tends to move in a progressive fashion, never looking back, only moving on to the next problem inevitably created by the last solution. So, the problem of scarcity led to the solution of agriculture, which created the problem of fertility, which led to the solution of artificial fertilizers, which led to the problem of toxicity, which will lead to the solution of gene-edited crops, which will more than likely, though don't quote me on this, will more than likely create some new problem that some new specialist will need to solve. But again, as Pope Francis highlights, the specialization which belongs to technology makes it difficult to see the larger picture. The fragmentation of knowledge proves helpful for concrete applications, he says, and yet it often leads to a loss of appreciation for the whole, for the relationships between things, for the broader horizon, which then becomes irrelevant. Life gradually, and this is still Pope Francis speaking, life gradually becomes a surrender to situations conditioned by technology, itself viewed as the principal key to the meaning of existence. We can glimpse the larger picture when we consider the fact that the industrially produced fertility, which directly contributes to the poisoning of water supplies, has by and large not gone to help the farmers of Adrian or anywhere else grow what we would recognize as the food we eat. The acres of crops around Adrian function more like mines, providing raw materials, than large-scale versions of your home garden or even the farms of 60 years ago. Drive in rural Minnesota and you will be in an ocean of corn and soybeans, none of which will arrive on dinner tables directly. Instead, it will pass into the hands and machines of various food companies who will break these crops down to their component parts, reusing these to produce fuel for our automobiles, feed for cattle, pigs, and poultry. I've even heard that farmed salmon are being fed corn, and the raw ingredients of our own processed food products. Through our use of artificial fertilizers, pesticides, information technology, genetic engineering, irrigation, and of course, fossil fuels, we have perfectly molded living beings, plants and animals, into predictable, uniform commodities. We've been very successful at it. In our industrial food system, we have succeeded in submitting the order of nature itself to our rule. But in so doing, we surrender the world and ourselves to the very cost of our success. In the words of an Adrian city official, contaminated water is just part of living in Adrian. We might avoid a direct experience of this contamination, but being full members of the food economy that produced it, we are partially responsible for it. Perhaps we ought to rephrase the city official's statement then to match our own sense of resignation. Contaminating water in Adrian, in the Gulf Coast, anywhere else, is just part of living. Resignation to this situation is easy because there's no clear way for one person to solve the problem. Within the technocratic paradigm, the only available options seem to be to passively await a technological solution. That is, we're waiting for those gene-engineered crops that will fix nitrate issues. Or we enter into the morally costly fray of winner-take-all partisan politics in order to change environmental protections. Though I think technology and law can be helpful and even needed, as I indicated in my last talk, I think the deeper root of our problems is the technocratic paradigm itself. Just as technocracy reduces our worth to our status in the economic system, so too does it reduce the world around us to the level of resources to be exploited. That is the problem. And just as I think rediscovering play and leisure in our daily life is key to resisting the degrading effects of technocracy on a personal and social level, like on our work-life balance, so too do I believe that play offers a lens, a paradigm even, for considering our relationship to food and our native soil. So I'm going to summarize a little bit about what I said in my last talk and then move on to how this applies in food and agriculture. In my last talk, I argued that God's act of creating the world is best understood as a kind of play. I said then that what Scripture and the reflection on Scripture revealed was that God creates in purest freedom, without conflict or strain. Similarly, God himself does not need to create in order to realize some hidden ulterior motive. In the scriptural reckoning of things, creation is therefore not a tool or technology for God, a means to some end. Instead, God creates because, and only because, it brings him delight to do so. And what he delights in is giving joy to his creatures. The game God is playing with his creatures is a game of selfless love, of delight in the good of the other. Human beings, made in God's image and likeness, are to be players, or homo ludens, from the Latin word for play, human players, realizing our innermost nature not so much in work and purpose, technology and tools, but in play, in the gratuitous things we do for nothing more than the sheer pleasures they bring, and most especially those forms of play that most closely reflect the selflessness of God's own loving play. That will be important later on. Much could be said about the difference of the technocratic and playful visions of the human being. As is clear, the two hold up very different models of human freedom, and these differences have an effect on virtually every aspect of human life. The question I wish to raise today, however, is what this vision of Deus ludens, the God who plays, and Homo ludens, the human who plays, might mean for our approach to food, and therefore ecology. As I mentioned earlier, mythologically, after the fall of Adam, we are forced to toil for our sustenance by the sweat of our brow. Play has nothing to do with it. And if it does have something to do with it, it is because the industrial food system has made more play possible by freeing us from the time commitment of hunting, growing, and cooking food. Technocracy argues it's responsible for our free time, for our leisure. And this has been the blatant argument of the industrial food system at all levels for the last 70 years. And it would be incontrovertible, except for the fact that it is simply wrong on a number of points. First, the liberation industrialization offers does not, in fact, simply liberate us from work and for greater leisure. Though it might seem that when we heat up a prepared meal, something frozen, something from a can, as a matter of fact, it doesn't. In order for the industrial processes to even exist, new forms of work must emerge. The machines, chemicals, and other technologies will all require some human labor to produce, Though being more efficient at large scale, many farmers will have no choice but to find work outside the food economy. And if they can't find work elsewhere, they must enjoy that liberation from work we more typically call unemployment. Second, and on a deeper level, the industrial food system errs in supposing that play and work, labor and leisure, are always strictly separate and opposed spheres of activity, when in fact they are not. Very often play and work are more like dimensions of human life. Sometimes we are clearly in one rather than the other. For instance, when we play a game, we're most likely more purely in that realm of play. Or when we do our taxes, maybe, we're more clearly in that dimension of work. More often, though, work and play overlap in one and the same activity or object. I imagine most of us can recall a time when we found some satisfaction in our work beyond the specific goals we were working toward. For instance, to speak a little personally, a few weeks ago I drove to my parents' home to help out with some yard work. The labor itself was quite mindless. Nothing more than breaking down mounds of dirt left over from some old raised garden beds. The weather was good that day, and truth be told, the actual task was not especially difficult. It just took some time and just a little bit of sweat. From a purely technocratic point of view, what I should have done was figure out how much it would have cost to have someone else do it. And if I could afford it, hire out the menial task and then use my time for something more worthwhile. Heck, I even could have used it to play. But when I think back on that day, I don't remember being frustrated, toiling away at something I was forced to do. Instead, I remember the smell of the dirt, the pleasant mixture of the warm sun and cool breeze, the slight ache from using muscles I normally don't use that much. I also remember the fascinating ant colonies, worms, and other bugs exposed by my shovel, the sights and sounds of my daughters playing at their grandparents' home, and talking with my dad as we worked. The technocratic paradigm can make nothing of those joys because they frustrate its one-dimensional cost-benefit analysis. But in those small joys, smack dab in the middle of what was clearly work, I got a taste of play. Cooking and growing food are instances in which the play and work dimensions of human life overlap particularly clearly. From the technocratic point of view, any eating is really just about energy exchange, and our industrial food system has excelled at giving us just what we want as quickly as possible. We can find virtually all the foods we could want to eat processed or frozen in our supermarkets, available for takeout or at fast food establishments, and if we are at the highest level of technocratic rationality, we would have the good sense to buy meal replacements and just get back to work. And based entirely on market trends, this is precisely what a great many of us do, especially poor Americans strapped for time and money. The popular food writer Michael Pollan recognizes that, given the apparent success of the industrial food system, just choosing to cook, doesn't matter what you cook, just choosing to cook is a minor act of rebellion against corporate technocracy. He writes, "In a world in which so few of us are obliged to cook at all anymore, to choose to do so is to lodge a protest against specialization, against the total rationalization of life, against the infiltration of commercial interests into every last cranny of our lives. To cook for the pleasure of it, to devote a portion of our leisure to it, is to declare our independence from the corporations seeking to organize every waking moment into yet another occasion for consumption. It is to reject the debilitating notion that at least while we're at home, production is work best done by someone else, and that the only legitimate form of leisure is consumption. This dependence marketers call freedom." Pollan's description of cooking as a protest against the powerful forces of rationalization, consumption, dependence, and specialization raises an important question. Why would we do it if we do not really have to? Why not just let someone else do the cooking for us? Again, many Americans, especially those low on the income ladder, have little or no choice in the matter and must take what the food system offers up. But for those of us who can choose to cook, the only real answer is that we cook simply because it brings us pleasure. Pollan suggests a number of reasons as to why cooking is so pleasurable. In the first instance, by cooking in defiance of technocratic specialization, we break free from our prescribed roles of worker and consumer. In the kitchen, when I am chopping vegetables, preparing a roast, kneading dough, or anything else, I am no longer just a teacher, at least in my case, just a teacher, or just a buyer of goods. I become in that moment a producer, providing for myself and my loved ones by my own native abilities rather than depending on the work of others. It is probably more than the mere thrill of It is probably more than the mere thrill of defying technocratic divisions of labor that we find satisfying in cooking. More likely, it is the productive, creative aspect itself. Put differently, cooking is not just play because we no longer have to do it. Cooking has always entailed play because it is an art. We speak of the art of cooking all the time. This is harder to defend on the face of it, to say that cooking is an art and therefore cooking is play. Because for most of human history, cooking has been a necessity, a necessary task for most families, and in particular, fell on the shoulders of women. Imagine a time without grocery stores, without gas or electric stoves, without refrigerators or even canning, and you get a sense of how much work cooking, merely producing food, must have been. Nevertheless, to cook always means to transform the raw stuff of nature through heat, fermentation, and combination into more complex forms. Even when pressed by great need or by strict limitations of culinary resources, in the act of cooking, the cook must play this transformation, freely selecting and combining from what's available, freely choosing the method of transformation, and in these many choices, the only strict rule of thumb is the pleasure they will bring us in the final dish. Even in the most humble of foods, made by the most economically marginalized or oppressed people, we invariably find the telltale signs of human play. Dishes that are always more than the sum of their parts, gratuitous in delight. Pollan proposes that the source of the delight of cooked food is what he calls its elusiveness. As he explains, and I quote again, quite apart from any specific references one food makes to another, it is the very elusiveness of cooked food that appeals to us, as indeed that same quality does in poetry or music or art. We gravitate toward complexity and metaphor, it seems, and putting meat to fire or fermenting fruit and grain gives us both. More sheer sensory information, and specifically sensory information that, like metaphor, points away from the here and now. This sensory metaphor, this stands for that, is one of the most important transformations of nature wrought by cooking. And so a piece of crisp pigskin becomes a densely elusive poem of flavors, coffee and chocolate, smoke and scotch, and overripe fruit, and the sweet, salty, woodsy taste of maple syrup on bacon I loved as a child. As with so many other things, we humans seem to like our food overdetermined. I apologize for the long quote, but Pollan is just such a skilled writer, it has to be read. Because cooking overdetermines food with more complexity, allusion, and metaphor, to cook and eat strike chords of deep pleasure, memory, and community for us. A sip of wine carries the chemical memory of the soil, sun, rain, and frost on the grapes, as well as the culture of its makers. A bite of the right dish can flood your mind with a moment from your own childhood, bringing you back to other times you ate that same dish, or maybe surprising you by reminding you of another dish entirely. What's more, we taste these illusions even when we cannot describe them, excepting perhaps the professional sommelier. The tongue cannot express in words the very mystery that it tastes. This is powerful, pleasing magic. And that is why even in its most humble forms, cooking and eating are always potentially interruptions from the ordinary flow of means and ends. Because of the artistic, playful transformation of food, because this transformation draws us into a web of taste and memory, every single meal has within it some trace of a great feast or a festival. And that is why, on occasion, we willingly waste our day laboring over a stove or oven, getting out the fine tablecloth and china, lighting a candle or two in order to celebrate a meal with our loved ones for a special occasion, or no real occasion at all. The full scope of the labor of bringing food to the table, bringing out the tablecloth, china, and candles serves very little purpose, and maybe even seem a little wasteful of time and energy that we could have spent elsewhere. But we do it simply because we love, and for that reason, it is a joy. I think the pleasures of eating should be a greater focus for Christians, and especially those of us who are distressed at our abuse of our common planetary home. It may come as something of a surprise to focus on pleasure when considering the environment. We have not been exactly encouraged to think that the remedy for our environmental woes, whether of climate change, water quality issues like an Adrian, or any other problems, would be pleasant. Most of what we talk about is what we have to cut out of our lives for the sake of the planet. But put in this way, we are very much in the realm of work, joylessly weighing and measuring how this or that possible action will affect global climate or water quality or whatever our pet issue is. Most of us are not in a position to weigh the full costs of any course of action in these respects. For instance, we're commonly told to cut out meat from our diet due to the climate impacts of methane from animal waste and the damage caused and climate impact of growing the corn that will feed the livestock in concentrated animal feeding operations. A lot of the corn around Adrian goes to these concentrated animal feeding operations. So it seems like fairly good advice to cut meat out. But we must be aware that many of the products offered to us to replace meat will carry their own costs, and that to judge whether we should eat meat solely on the basis of overall impacts on climate or the environment encourages technocratic efforts to make clean concentrated animal feeding operations. They might be just as immoral, just as barbaric, but at least they're clean. Rather than an environmental ethics based on utilitarian reasoning, I think we Christians need to promote an ecological aesthetics, or as I would say, an ecology of play that takes seriously our nature as creatures made for play and pleasure, as I outlined in my last talk, as I summarized earlier. What would such an ecology of play look like, and what does it have to do with cooking? Well, as the agrarian writer Wendell Berry famously puts it, eating is an agricultural act. And because eating is an agricultural act, to eat always places us in an extraordinarily complex web of relationships. And when we cook, we actively enter into those relationships. Once again, I'm sorry to do it, I've got to quote him again. Michael Pollan describes this with his characteristic eloquence. To brew beer, he says, to make cheese, to bake a loaf of bread, to braise a pork shoulder, is to be forcibly reminded that all these things are not just products. In fact, are not even really things. Most of what presents itself to us in the marketplace as a product is in truth a web of relationships between people, yes, but also between ourselves and all the other species on which we still depend. Eating and drinking especially implicate us in the natural world in ways that the industrial economy, with its long and illegible supply chains, would have us forget. The beer in that bottle, I'm reminded as soon as I brew it myself, ultimately comes not from a factory, but from nature, from a field of barley snapping in the wind, from a hops vine clambering over a trellis, from a host of invisible microbes feasting on sugars. It took the carefully orchestrated collaboration of three far-flung taxonomic kingdoms, plants, animals, and fungi, to produce that ale. to make it yourself once in a while, to handle the barley and inhale the aroma of hops and yeast becomes, among other things, a form of observance, a weekend ritual of remembrance. The world becomes literally more wonderful and wonderfully more literal as soon as we are reminded of these relationships. They unfold over the span of evolutionary time, but also over the course of a few hours on a Sunday in a neighbor's backyard. He's just really good. Had to read the whole thing again. It is possible to cook and eat with little to no regard for this complex web of relationships. And as Paulin notes, the industrial food system works awfully hard to obscure this web. But sometimes, particularly when we cook and eat food we have grown ourselves, we are reminded of them. In such moments, we not only enjoy the immediate pleasures of good tasting food, but we enjoy additional, deeper pleasures. In one of his classic essays, Barry explains these extensive pleasures, or what he calls the extensive pleasure of eating. I quote at length again, "The pleasures of eating should be an extensive pleasure, not that of the mere gourmet. People who know the garden in which their vegetables have grown and know that the garden is healthy will remember the beauty of the growing plants, perhaps in the dewy first light of morning when gardens are at their best. Such a memory involves itself with the food and is one of the pleasures of eating. The knowledge of the good health of the garden relieves and frees and comforts the eater. The same goes for eating meat," he says. "The thought of the good pasture and of the calf contentedly grazing flavors the steak. Some, I know, will think it bloodthirsty or worse to eat a fellow creature you have known all its life. On the contrary, I think it means that you eat with understanding and with gratitude. A significant part of the pleasure of eating is one's accurate consciousness of the lives and the world from which food comes. Eating with fullest pleasure, pleasure that is, that does not depend on ignorance, is perhaps the profoundest enactment of our connection with the world. In this pleasure, we experience and celebrate our dependence and our gratitude, for we are living from mystery, from creatures we did not make and powers we cannot comprehend." End quote. As Barry sees it, the knowledge of the health and well-being of the creatures we eat makes our food more satisfying. The knowledge of the content cow and healthy garden do, he thinks, enhance the flavor of the final dish. Paulin argues much the same. His classic advice about food is to eat good food, food that is fresh and of the highest quality you can afford, and there will be a difference in taste. Carlo Petrini, the founder of the slow food movement, has modeled that this pursuit of gastronomic pleasure can be a firm basis of a countercultural politics that supports local food culture and fellowship while resisting the industrial uniformity and high speed of contemporary life. But I think Barry is saying more than that, more than just eating good food brings pleasure. And what I think he says brings us full circle to a theology of play. He is suggesting that the unlooked for, unexpected, gratuitous pleasures that accompany the actual growing of food, that dewy first light of morning when gardens are at their best, as he said, also find their way into the joys of eating. It's not simply the health of the food that makes it tasty, it's the abundance of pleasures that accompany the food that make it good. The food somehow, I don't know how, gathers together these pleasures, all of them, the extensive pleasures, and offers them up to us as we dine. Put differently, the pleasures of eating come from wonder, the wonder of mundane things concentrated in our food and transfigured by love. In calling to mind these small wonders, I'm once again reminded of the scriptural account of creation. Not the first myth, which plays out on a grand cosmic scale, but the second, much older and much humbler myth. The Lord God planted a garden. and he placed there the human whom he had formed. Out of the ground, the Lord God made various trees to grow that were delightful to look at and good for food. The Lord God then took the human and settled him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and care for it. From a Christian perspective, recognizing the useless beauties of the pasture, our own gardens, or the delights of the smell of onion, garlic, and olive oil in a pan that enhance our eating are all so many glimpses of Eden. Importantly for the Christian, those delights, are not accidental or negligible features of the world around us that we can or should discard. They are, as Barry puts it in one of his poems, the signature of love indwelling in all created things, called from nothing by love, recognized and answered by love in the human heart, not reducible by any analysis to any fact. Out of the infinite freedom of his love, God called the universe into being for no purpose other than his own delight in loving it. As human beings, we are blessed to be able and share in that very same delight. That is our taste of Eden. That is the pleasure of eating. Looking at the world, even those parts of the world that we will use for our own sustenance in this manner, gives us an alternative to the technocratic system that leads to the poisoning of places like Adrian. Technocracy would have us suppose that the ability to act gives us the license to act, and takes no interest in the fact of our ignorance of the web of life that sustains us. In Adrian, we know with certainty that the artificial fertilizers are harmful for human beings. But we know precious little about how they have affected the health of the soil. What has artificially produced nitrogen, applied in great quantity, done to the processes that make possible this health? The processes of unknown duration, encompassing the life and death of animals, plants, fungi, and bacteria, as well as the geological and climate changes of the earth itself. In agriculture as elsewhere, in the course of a mere century, we have possibly squandered sustainable riches that are the result of literal eons. To see the signature of love indwelling in all created things places a demand on us, a vocation to care for the garden, as the Genesis myth puts it. And such care must begin in our self-restraint as we consider how best to interact with and act upon the creatures of the world, especially when new technologies are available. Technocracy would have us think that invoking self-restraint curtails our freedom. But I would encourage us to rethink restraint in terms of play. In a game or artistic endeavor, we freely put limits on ourselves in rules, frames, and boundaries. With respect to ecology and agriculture, then, caring for creation should encourage us to relearn the boundaries, rules, or frame of a given place, or what Barry and his friend Wes Jackson calls the measure of nature, so that we can play in the garden well. This education will be intensely local. Even though our relationships with creation extend out to embrace the globe, our active care for the world is planted in specific places, among unique persons and particular things. This is obvious when we consider agriculture. What can be grown and raised in the prairie country of Adrian will be different from what can be grown in the hill country of Appalachia, or the arid regions of the American West, or in biomes throughout the world. Moreover, growing and raising well in these places will require diversity. The good health and well-being of any specific place is the result of the interaction of a host of species, plant, animal, bacteria, fungi, only some of which will make it to our tables. Cultivating a diversity of species in particular places will lead to a flourishing of local food cultures as we play around learning what grows well in our home. What combinations of local flavors create the best taste? The great culinary traditions of the world all bear that local stamp. We can have that too. And all that is required is to attend to our place on earth out of familiarity, reverence, and affection. the attitudes that mirror God's own love of the world in his creative play. What is most remarkable is that once we approach our place on earth and are eating in this way, with this restraint and reverence, it will remain fertile and productive as long as nature lasts. Our yields may be down, but it will be fertile and productive as long as nature lasts. That our agricultural self-restraint can lead to a virtually inexhaustible flourishing of life, and thereby lead to the kind of extensive pleasures Barry spoke of, should remind us of the Sabbath and similar moments of rest woven into the fabric of God's covenant with Israel, of which I spoke 2 weeks ago. We saw then how the day of rest was instituted by God, not as a day off from work alone, so that humankind could work harder the next day, but as Heschel put it, the climax of living. We saw further that the Sabbath was not for humankind alone. Domesticated animals too were supposed to share in the joy of the day. Going further yet, in the book of Leviticus, God commands that when the Israelites enter into the land that God would give them, they were to grant the land its own Sabbath every 7 years by not sowing or tending a crop, harvesting and eating only what the land produced on its own. This may be nothing more than a divine justification for what is sound agricultural sense. The land always needs some kind of rest to recuperate, and therefore farmers need to practice habitual restraint. But given the link established between the land sabbatical year and the Sabbath day, I think we should see something deeper in the land Sabbath. The Sabbath day, as Rabbi Heschel says, is our share in eternity in time. And so perhaps we can say that the sabbatical year grants the earth itself some share in eternity too, a period in which it is allowed to spend its vital energies simply in being rather than in being used. We grant the land and all of its creatures their own time to thrive and play under the gaze of God. Though we are no longer subject to the letter of the law, we are still meant to breathe its spirit. Like the Israelites, like Adam, our covenant is completed by offering to God the flourishing of his creation. Thank you.